I went camping with my cousin Randall and Courtney. He used to go every year with his parents, but now that he was an adult, it had been years since his last hike. We decided to go to our national park, which is known for its rugged and remote terrain. The hike lasted 3 hours, but as we went deeper into the forest, we didn't encounter a soul. By the time we set up camp, the sun had already set. We sat around the campfire, roasting marshmallows and chatting. All we could hear was the crackling of the fire and the occasional owl's hoot. It was so quiet and peaceful that we forgot about the stresses of everyday life for a while. However, this tranquility was suddenly broken by a sound coming from far away. The sound was like someone knocking on wood. All of us froze, staring at each other with wide-open eyes. "What was that sound?" Randall asked in a whisper. We chatted for a few minutes, and I was impressed with his knowledge and experience. I had previously worked as a camp counselor and had been trained in wilderness environments. I grabbed my flashlight and headed toward the noise. The moonlight was still strong, so I didn't turn on the flashlight right away. I wanted to be sure before I scared the animal away. My heart was pounding as I walked cautiously in the direction of the sound. As I got closer, I saw a figure standing in the woods. I couldn't see it clearly, but I was sure it was a man. He was standing with his back to me. I hid behind a tree so he wouldn't turn around. I waited for what seemed like an eternity, but eventually the figure disappeared into the woods. I walked back to camp, my heart still pounding. "There's someone out there, guys," I said. My voice shook. There was a man in the woods. He was just standing there, not looking at me, but he was there. We all looked at each other, scared and confused at the same time. Courtney asked. We decided to go to bed, but I couldn't sleep. I lay in my sleeping bag and listened to the sounds of the forest. All night long, I could hear footsteps circling around our campsite. I didn't move, thinking there might be something lurking out there. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, but it was very real. I really felt like there was someone there. What could I do? Eventually, the sun came up, and I felt more relaxed than I had ever felt before. I got out of the tent and walked around the yard. I knew right away that someone had been here. Nothing was missing here, but there were cigarette butts lying everywhere. What scared me even more was that there was a hole in the flap of my cousin's tent that hadn't been there before. As we hastily cleared the camp, our nerves were on edge. We didn't feel like anyone was watching us. The startling truth was revealed when we noticed several rough stick figures in a circle near the tent, each holding a small twisted doll hanging from a branch. We shuddered when we realized that these eerie symbols had been left by the forest rangers. They not only indicated the presence of an observer, but also indicated that he was playing with something incomprehensible. I've never been a fan of camping, but the summer of sophomore year, one of my roommates invited me to go camping with him. It was a weekend and there wasn't much to do, so I agreed to go with him. For the sake of confidentiality, I will refer to him as Jack. Jack was a man of action. He has a 2014 Jeep Wrangler, the back seat of which is stuffed with almost all kinds of camping gear. He doesn't like to make reservations for camping spots, but finds them himself. He drove a bit through the Rocky Mountains and found a crack in the bush, big enough for his Jeep to drive into. Then we drove through the trees until Jack pointed out a good spot for us. We set up a fire and chairs, put up our tents, and stayed the night. The sun started to set around 7 p.m. Jack went back to the car and brought some hot dogs to roast on the fire. But it was simple food, and Jack wanted me to feel like a real camper. Just as we were grilling hot dogs, a woman's scream echoed through the woods 300 or 400 feet away. I looked up and saw that Jack was looking in the direction the scream had come from. At first, I couldn't hear what she was saying, but she kept repeating, "Help, please," and "No," each time more desperate than the last. The loudest, most terrified scream abruptly cut off halfway through. Jack looked back at me with an expression of pure terror on his face. As far as we knew, the nearest man-made structure was the road, and it was far away. There shouldn't be anyone there. Whatever we heard, it didn't matter. We knew we had to get out as soon as possible. We began frantically throwing things into the back of the Jeep. We closed the doors and stuffed the assembled tent inside. As we walked to the road, we tried to call 911. The phone barely worked, but we got through to an operator. The operator tried to explain what we were hearing and said he would send an officer as soon as possible. This time we couldn't see anything, and it took us twice as long to get back on the road. Finally, we saw a paved road and stopped for a while. I wasn't sure if I should wait for the police. At that moment, I saw a figure emerge from behind a tree in front of me. He was wearing jeans and a black hooded sweatshirt that covered his face. He was dragging a thick sheet or bag behind him. He walked with his head down, almost motionless. He glanced up at us as blue and red patrol lights appeared on the road. The man turned, snatched the bag from his hands, and ran back into the woods. The police officers saw him and started chasing him. It turned out that the bag he was dragging contained the remains of a 34-year-old woman. Whether or not they caught him is unknown. I don't know if I'm in the right place, but for the past 6 years I've kept this story to myself because it sounds really crazy. I've been told many times not to talk about it. 6 years ago, I went camping with my now ex-boyfriend. The campground we chose was beautiful. We could drive on rough roads, and the place we chose was close to hiking trails, natural hot springs, and a large waterfall nearby. We were in a secluded location with no one around. We camped next to the car, took a walk, soaked in the hot springs, came back, had dinner, and everything was fine until we woke up the next day. To help you understand my confusion, I'll tell you how I slept that night. Before I went to bed, I put the refrigerator with the food and stereo I had brought with me in the car and locked it. I put my keys in the front pocket of my backpack and put the backpack next to my sleeping bag on the far side of the tent door. My boyfriend slept on the side that was closer to the tent door, with his gun next to him. When I woke up the next morning, I felt completely normal. I hadn't slept well, but from inside the tent, everything looked normal. When I went outside, the campground was in chaos. The campfire we had made had been destroyed. The refrigerator was abandoned and food was scattered everywhere. The stereo system was smashed and lying by a tree. All the car doors were open, including the trunk. We stood in complete silence, watching everything that was happening. The forest seemed somehow alien. It was quiet and not at all like the beautiful campground we had seen yesterday. Everything about this forest seemed wrong. My ex-husband immediately blamed me for not locking the car the night before, and the animals could get into our stuff. I promised I had locked it and reached into the tent to get the keys out of my backpack, but the keys weren't there. We quickly threw all of our stuff in the trunk and left. My boyfriend didn't want to tell me what had happened and kept quiet. After a while, when we were almost home, he finally told me. He said that the night before he had dreamed that something was kneeling in the tent, holding a gun and looking at him. I tried to ask him more questions, but he fell silent again and said he didn't want to talk about it anymore and that he shouldn't talk to anyone else. I tried to forget, but I couldn't. Something very bad happened to us that night in the forest.